This DVD is focused on growing Tosai to Jumbo, or at least choosing Tosai with the right kind of attributes to become good Jumbo Koi. But to enable this to be easier, what we're actually first doing is looking at Nisai, and in this case 3 Nisai that are extremely high level fish and also one very high level Sanzai, because once you manage to understand the aspects of these fish that differentiate the different body types and colours and things like that, it then becomes a whole lot easier to apply those theories to choosing Tosai. And hopefully, if we look at these fish first, you will then be able to identify the subtle differences in Tosai a lot easier, having borne in mind this part of the video. So we have 4 fish now in the bowl. They're actually 4 completely different bloodlines, although 3 of them appear to be very similar. And as you can see looking at this first fish, the body type on this, although it appears to be very powerful and strong, the length of the body in relation to the head is slightly short and slightly stocky. And although this worries me a little bit, this is actually a very new bloodline that I have a very little understanding of. But I think that despite this body being this kind of length, if you like, in proportion to its width, I still hope that it's still going to become a good big fish in the future. But there is an element of gamble with this. This body type, as you can see, the height of the fish is extremely good, but it does appear to be slightly short in the body, whereas the head just seems to be magnificent. The head is very long and very broad between the eyes. So there is that slight question mark over just how big it's going to get. But despite those proportions, I think it hopefully will grow beyond 80 cm without too much trouble. Now this fish I think has actually got the best combination of attributes for getting big. The body type is very long, the backbone is very, very strong. The relationship between the body length and also the head I think is very well balanced. And if you look at the body type here, the profile of the head is very nice with good height over the head, which then goes on to the shoulder area and then continues to rise up over the back of the fish. The backbone, as you can see, is also very strong and very thick, and I think this is a particularly nice body line, and out of the 4 fish in the bowl is the best combination. The body line underneath as well, the belly line if you like, is nice and tight on this fish as well. And I think in the future this is really the most certain fish for growing jumbo and also holding a good body. Now this kind of hollowed out look that you can almost see on the backbone is a very good sign for the future as far as how the fish will put on body weight. When you see this hollowed out look, what it's telling you is that when the fish grows bigger, the backbone either side of this backbone ridge is going to fill out and flesh up a lot more, which is giving you an indication that hopefully when the fish gets bigger it's capable of putting on a lot more weight. And then what you'll see is the backbone where it's hollow will have this kind of profile, and then as it slowly grows up it will slowly fill out in this kind of manner. This koi is a different bloodline to the last one. Now you can see that the head on the fish appears to be a little bit shorter, but it is very broad in the head. And what you're actually seeing here is the fish is just a little bit shorter in the face. That won't really affect its likelihood to get big. It's purely really an aesthetic issue, where obviously you would prefer to have a longer face, if you like, on the fish. I don't think this will affect its ability to grow, but it purely, when it does get jumbo, it will retain this kind of look, where it is a little bit shorter in the face, but it's no problem. But the body type on this fish is still particularly good. You've got that same very thick, strong backbone, and you've got good height to the fish, and also a very long, good, strong body for growing big in the future. Now if we look at the Sanzai, you'll see that the body type doesn't really have the same sense of power as the Nisai, and also the backbone's not really so strong and doesn't have the same kind of height. This is actually a very different bloodline altogether that does have some Sankey roots going back a few generations ago, so it's kind of more of a Sankey body type. Having said that, it is just slightly more delicate and a little bit more feminine, and the way that it pulls into its tail tube is a little bit weaker. The fish is extremely high quality and should grow reasonably big nonetheless, but it's not really such an ideal for looking for a younger fish with the kind of body to get jumbo.
Mike, can I just jump in? You mentioned the backbone and why it wasn't as good as some of the others. Is there an ideal point where you'd hope the backbone would continue to climb to? If it flattens out too early, does that affect the fish? How far through the fish should the backbone continue to climb?
I would like to see the highest part of the backbone to be around about this area, and then continue that kind of height through the sort of mid-dorsal area before it starts going down. If the fish is too high in its backbone too early on, you tend to find that the fish will almost take on a slightly chesty look or too thick in the shoulders, and I prefer that body line to actually be thicker a little bit further back. If we look at this fish on the other hand, you can see that the height is here around the front of the dorsal area, and it's retaining a good height all the way really through the dorsal. So this kind of body has got a very good back line on it for carrying the right weight distribution. This koi also has a good body profile and good height to it, although not so much height as the other. And this particular fish I think has got the best height and backbone combination of the lot. The height of the fish is ideal, and it maintains that height all the way through, and maintains a very good body line underneath all the way through. And these combination of aspects of this fish are a very good combination for something that's very predictable to get big and jumbo and carry good body weight. Now if we turn to colour, colour is very important, because if you have colour that is too finished and too progressed too early in life, then that colour just simply won't last very long. So what we're looking for is an ideal colour in relation to its bloodline, so that we can predict that in the future the fish will finish up a lot later in life and therefore look more beautiful later in life as a jumbo fish, and also hold its colour quality for longer as a jumbo fish. Another thing that is important to bear in mind is to have some kind of understanding of the colour type that you're looking at, because if the colour is a very soft kind of colour, then it's important not to choose something that's too red in relation to that bloodline, because that will peak too early and then won't hold its quality. But likewise, if you're looking at a bloodline that is very red genetically, and you're looking at something that is actually too soft and looks like it's a good prospect to the future, quite often those fish actually never really come good, because the quality is just not really there in the first place. But if you realise that it's a redder kind of colour, then it's easier to choose a youthful representation of that particular colour that hopefully will become the kind of colour later on in life that it should, rather than just being a fish that looks like a good prospect, but because you don't understand the bloodline or the colour type, it never actually becomes good, and instead goes the opposite way when the fish gets older. Now this particular koi, although it's Sanzai and you would expect the colour to be a little bit more finished up because of that, it's actually a redder kind of bloodline altogether. And because of this, it can be a very tricky one to get right. So it's very important to get the colour type with this particular bloodline to be an ideal representation of this bloodline, so that it will peak later on in life in the way that you would expect it to. Because if this one was too red, then it will just fall apart later on in life. And if it's too orange, quite often with this lineage, it's very difficult for the fish to actually peak later on in life and become beautiful. It will kind of look like it's going to get better, but perhaps never will do. This fish on the other hand, I think it's a different bloodline again, but this particular colour type is one that's very forgiving. It's very easy to buy one from this lineage that perhaps is a little bit more orange and a little bit more redder on the other hand, and yet still when the fish gets bigger and older, they actually hold their beauty very nice and long term anyway. So it's a lot easier bloodline to get right.
While we're talking about colour, it gets even more confusing when you hear of breeders where the fish come in quite red because of how they've been kept and raised in Japan, and then the colour softens up and goes more orange. Does that apply to any of these fish, and how does that affect your choices in Japan? I guess it's knowing how the breeders have kept the fish.
It is very important to understand how the breeders have raised the koi, because some breeders use more colour food than others, so as a young koi it would look redder, and yet when you get it home the colour will actually soften up and become more orange because your raising technique is different. Whereas other breeders use less colour food, and yet when you take those fish home, those fish on the other hand with your raising techniques actually become redder. And likewise, different areas of Japan have actually got different minerals or metals within the water, and that also has an influence on the colour. So some fish you wouldn't really like the bloodline because maybe for your liking it's just generally too red. And yet if you take that fish home and raise the fish yourself, you will actually find that the colour will change in a relatively short space of time and become perhaps a lot more to your liking. And it can also be the case that because of this influence, the fish will actually never appear to be in particularly good condition at the breeder's premises, and yet when you get the fish home they seem to clean up. The white skin becomes much nicer and brighter, and the colour also becomes brighter. And this is because of that kind of predominance, if you like, of metals like perhaps iron and things like that that can actually make the condition of the fish or colour and skin not look as attractive as perhaps it should naturally be. So the influence of this is such that maybe some fish from one geographical area look a little bit redder than another breeder's fish, but in reality, when you've had them at home and you've raised the fish in your own pond, you'll find that some of these bloodlines are actually not so dissimilar. The colour type can actually be much the same, but purely the raising techniques or the water that the breeder's got has given the fish a different look. So with this all in mind, it is actually quite important to understand the bloodlines, or if you like, the lineage of the fish in question as far as the parents are concerned, because you do need to know what goes into the mix, like where the female parent's from and where that fish's origins are, and also where the males originated from, because it gives you a much better idea of what to expect. And it particularly helps if you understand why the breeder has used fish from a particular bloodline, in order to understand what he was trying to exploit from that particular parent, whether it was body or whether it was colour. It certainly helps you make a better informed choice.
So more than it being bloodlines, it's more of a family tree?
Yes, it is actually kind of like a family tree, if you like. You are looking for certain traits that are coming from certain parents, and this is what you really need to think about and try and exploit. And I think it's fair to say that in many cases, if you look at the breeder's parent fish when perhaps they were in their prime, when the breeder first bought them, it's quite easy to actually identify what it was that the breeder was looking for in that parent fish. And it's also quite easy to actually then look to the offspring and see a similar kind of body type or a similar kind of colour type or kiwa, that kind of thing. It's very easy to see traits actually that have been carried down to the offspring. Obviously when the parent fish get older, they start to fall apart a little bit, so it then can be a little bit harder to identify. But if you ask a breeder to show you perhaps pictures of their fish when they first bought them, it gives you a much better indication in this regard. I actually had a guy going back a few years ago, a guy from China, that said to me that he was actually studying history, and he said, how can you understand where you're going if you don't know where you've been? And I think you can apply this very much to koi. You need to understand some kind of history behind the fish in order to actually get some good idea, if you like, about where the fish is going. Now, if we look at kiwa, kiwa is something I think that people very often overlook in the UK. They place very little importance on it. But kiwa, I think, is extremely important if you're trying to buy a fish that grows up to become really good as a jumbo fish. And for me personally, I like obviously Maruzomi kiwa, much as everybody does, but I also like to see a combination of Maruzomi and straight cut kiwa, with a bias in favour obviously of Maruzomi. But if some of the scales within the pattern are cut straight across the scale, I think this is actually a good thing, because it does give you some indication that the fish is genetically going to be much tougher in the colour department. And also some of this straight cut kiwa, when the fish gets older, will actually change a little bit as well. This particular fish, you can see, has got quite a lot of straight cut kiwa or Kamisori kiwa. And if you look towards the back end of the fish and certainly lower down on the pattern on this one, you can see that it's predominantly Maruzomi further down. But what you can also see is this kind of soft and incomplete look to the kiwa, which hopefully as the fish gets bigger will slowly change and very slowly fill and creep in and become really, really nice and sharp later on in life. The reason I say this is that with this kind of kiwa, it will quite often change, because sometimes what you'll see in a young fish is that the kiwa, although it's Kamisori, you'll see it's a little bit incomplete on one or two scales, and that will change very, very easily if the colour type is ideal. That kiwa will slowly creep as the fish gets older and slowly fill in until perhaps it fills an entire scale. And I think this kind of colour is very, very good. It's much better than perhaps having Maruzomi kiwa that's Maruzomi on every single scale and appears to be very perfect on a young fish, because that kind of colour when the fish grows up will actually tend to deteriorate and maybe even break up on certain scales of kiwa. A lot of breeders actually, when they're choosing parent koi, will actually favour fish that have predominantly Maruzomi kiwa but also some Kamisori kiwa. And the reason that they favour this is because they feel that fish with this kind of kiwa will produce offspring that hopefully will be longer lasting. So for me personally, when I'm choosing fish, I always like to see some kiwa that perhaps is Kamisori on one or two scales as well, because they certainly do seem to last much longer. One thing that gives you evidence of this happening is where you can see this colour where it appears to be slightly creeping backwards into the fukurin. And where this happens, it tends to appear later on to be very, very sharp and very, very attractive, because it softens up the look, generally speaking, of Maruzomi Kiwa. Makes it look more kind of dignified, if you like, as it cuts across a pattern.
Just for those watching the DVD who might not know, fukurin is the skin surrounding the scales?
That's right, Greg. The fukurin is the skin that grows out from between the scales and kind of laps back onto the root of the scale behind, and gives you that kind of thick webbed look between the scales. In this instance, you can see the fukurin within the colour quite clearly, because in this case it's actually the slightly paler line of colour that you can see at the base of each scale. This is actually the fukurin. Now if we look at sashi, sashi style is very, very important and tells us an awful lot about how the koi will grow up and how refined the koi will become later on. It's very important to have sashi, because if there's no sashi on the fish, what that's telling you is that the colour only really exists in the surface of the scale, where the scale is really exposed to light and oxygen. And likewise, if you've got too much sashi to the fish, it can quite often result in the fish maybe getting secondary he later in life, or perhaps when the fish gets jumbo, the sashi is actually just too deep and too uneven for it to become beautiful. So it just keeps a look of unrefinement, if you like, and too messy when the fish gets big. I think this koi really has what I regard as being perfect sashi. You can see if you look here that it's got what appears to be one scale deeper sashi, but if you look very closely, you can't really define just where that sashi stops. So although it's one scale deep, that front edge of that one scale depth of sashi almost blurs away or fades away to nothing, so it's very, very hard to say, okay, it stops here. This kind of sashi is very, very easy for the fish to grow up and become really refined and really, really tight and beautiful later on. And it's also very important with sashi like this that it's very, very even from one scale to the next. What you don't want is sashi that's nice and soft and blends away to nothing on one scale, and the next scale is very prominent and very deep sashi, because that kind of sashi is very, very difficult to become refined later on. And if we look at the Sanzai, you can see that this one, although the sashi is still reasonably good, it's a little bit unrefined compared to the Nisai. It's a little bit slightly uneven from one scale to the other, and around the tail tube also, you can see that it's slightly uneven. It's still really no problem, but the Nisai really, the sashi is a little bit more ideal.
So the big key is how even it is.
Yeah, how even it is, and also where the sashi appears to disappear or into the white ground. This is important, but those two characteristics. What you'll find is as the fish grows up, the scales become thicker and the surface skin on top of the scales also become thicker. And this is what makes the sashi recede, because that soft edge of the sashi, if you like, where the red is intersecting underneath the white scale, is slowly pulling back because that scale is getting thicker and stopping the translucence, if you like, of the scale from allowing that red to shine through the white scale in front. So as the fish gets older, that sashi will actually slowly tighten up and pull back and back and back because of the stopping the colour from shining through the white skin in front.
That's a good comment, I think. A lot of people think sashi recedes, but it's actually the white skin thickening.
That's right. What really happens is as the fish gets older, the scales become thicker and the white skin obviously on top of the scale becomes thicker, so it is literally hiding the colour as the fish gets older. It's hiding the colour and stopping it from showing through. And you'll find that nowadays most Kohaku have got a lot of Sensuke blood in them, so you'll find that when they get big, the scales on those fish on that bloodline get so thick that they'll almost create a situation whereby you can't really see any sashi at all. What you end up with is almost like an almost sharp edge to the front of the pattern, because the white scales are just so thick that the colour won't shine through at all as a jumbo fish.
So nice thick skin is good for the future of the fish?
Exactly. Thin skin tends to look very translucent and transparent and never really develops any kind of shine or thickness to it, whereas thick skin will quite often look a little bit creamy looking when it's young, and then when the fish grows up, that skin becomes very, very thick and very, very shiny and bright. And in this regard, this fish really is the best prospect in the bowl. The skin on this fish is particularly thick and shiny, and when this fish grows up, it should be a fantastic prospect in that department. And more often than not, when you look at a fish whereby the skin quality is not so good, you'll also see that the colour quality also appears to be not so good. So if the skin on a fish is a little bit translucent, you'll also see that same kind of look to the colour, where the colour also lacks shine and solidity, so it looks a little bit translucent as well. So if you're a little bit unsure about skin quality on a fish and how thick and shiny the skin is, you can often look to the colour and see just how thick and solid and glossy the colour is, and that will give you a better indication of what the skin's like if maybe the skin is in not so good condition.
I always liken colour to what I do, and that's paintwork, and always try to think of it as the fish matures and grows up, it will kind of develop layers of paint and get glossier and thicker.
That's right, really. You're applying, if you like, layers of lacquer on top of each other, which is developing more shine and more thickness to the colour. And it's fair to say that as the fish grows up, its scales becomes thicker, the skin becomes thicker, and therefore also the same thing happens with the colour, whereby the scales get thicker and therefore the colour pigment cells, if you like, become denser on the fish and make that colour look more solid and thicker. So you get kind of like a thicker, richer kind of colour to the fish as it grows up if it's raised well. You can see here that the colour on the root of the scale is actually darker to the colour in the fucarin, but when the fish gets bigger and older, what you'll find is the colour within the fucarin will also become thicker and create a thicker, stronger look across the scales, with the scales being less apparent.
The darker area, is that what I've heard called hoshi?
Indeed. Although I have to say, hoshi is never a word that I've heard mentioned in Japan. I've only ever heard that amongst English hobbyists. But yeah, when the fish gets bigger and older, what you'll see is that colour will eventually colour up to the same kind of colour as the root of the scale. So that becomes less apparent as the fish gets big.
Because the fish is more focusing on its coloration and finish as opposed to out and out growth.
Yes, so when the fish gets bigger, what you actually find, if you like, when it slows down in growth, the fish then gets a chance really to catch up in the colour department and find some kind of equilibrium in its development. One thing I often hear people talking about in the UK is Sankey eyes, and this is something that's always baffled me, because if you look at these fish, all of these Kohaku have got blue eyes. Or what some people might call Sankey eyes, but they're clearly not Sankey, and they're clearly not Sankey bloodline anywhere in their history, as it were, or certainly not with three of them. One thing that I would regard as being normal really with Sankey is if maybe you've got some sumi within the iris of the fish, but as you can imagine, if you saw a Kohaku and you had sumi in the iris, it would be pretty damn off-putting, and certainly not something that I would be able to tolerate if I was buying the koi. But if you can see with all of these fish have got very much of a silver iris, although the ball of the eye does appear to be somewhat blue. But this is perfectly normal.
Sorry, I just want to clarify what you said about black in the iris. Do you mean the eye itself? The actual lens will be
Not the
black?
lens, but the actual iris. So if you see the iris on this particular fish, you can see that it's actually silver, whereas Sankey sometimes you'll have little flecks of sumi or black within that iris, which can be quite off-putting, well, very off-putting.
The silver area is the ring around the outside?
Yeah, Sankey quite often have flecks of sumi actually in the iris, but we'll cover that one shortly with Sankey. So in conclusion with these Nisei Kohaku, I think this particular fish is the best overall package in terms of the body type for getting big and how it will carry that body, and also its combination, if you like, of that and colour type and so on. Now as far as colour condition and quality goes right now, I think this particular one is the best. The body's not so strong as the other, but I think it will also grow jumbo very easily. But this one's really got the best colour and skin. And this fish, I think the quality is very, very nice, but I think perhaps it's very slightly chancy as far as its body type is concerned, as far as growing jumbo is. There's an element of gamble there, but hopefully it's still going to get big anyway.
You also mentioned earlier when we were talking about easier and harder to keep. What do you mean? Why is a particular colour harder to keep and another easier to keep?
What I generally find is that if a fish has a redder kind of colour, that colour can be a little bit tricky to keep it at its peak condition. And also, some of the redder Benny types tend to be a little bit more prone to shimmies as well. Another issue I tend to find with redder colour types are that they tend to be a little bit more prone to weakness within the colour or terry issues. And although this isn't really a terry issue with this fish, if you look here, you can see it looks as though the tip of the scale here is a little bit transparent, where there's actually lack of pigment on the tip of the scale. Now if you imagine that being within the middle of the pattern with that transparent look on the tip of the scale, that's actually what you would regard as being a terry weakness or colour weakness. So it's kind of where the pigment cells actually die off within the scale itself, and cause the scale to become transparent on the tip of the scale. I find some softer colour types are actually generally easier to keep and easier to grow big and keep in good condition. But I think in this regard it also pays to look at jumbo fish from the breeder in question just to see what kind of colour condition they've got, because if the colour condition on their jumbo fish is all fallen apart, then it's quite likely that the fish you're looking at and with a proposal to buy, as it were, will also go the same way and not last so well. So if you look at a breeder's jumbo fish and you see that all of his fish have really nice colour condition, really good terry and lack of shimmies, that kind of thing, then I think it's probably a pretty safe bet that if you buy his offspring, then they will grow up the same way.
Does Hikui fit into the same thing as well?
Hikui is something that people have got different opinions on. Some breeders think that Hikui is a genetic issue, so they'll say that they'll never breed from a parent fish that's got Hikui, whereas other people also say that Hikui is something that's brought on by bad filtration and dirty filters, that kind of thing. So I think realistically, if you just try to buy from a fish whereby, or buy from a breeder whereby the fish don't seem to have any problems with Hikui, and then keep your pond in such a way that it's as clean a system as possible, then hopefully you'll not have any issues with Hikui later on with those fish. So the problem with the DVD so far really is that the 4 fish in question that we've been talking about are all actually very, very high level fish. So just to make things a little bit easier, what we're going to do now is to put 2 other fish in to the bowl that are a much lower level. And that way, by comparing the 2 lower quality fish, it's a whole lot easier to understand then just how good the good ones are. So we'll now pick up 2 more and put those in. Now a lot of people I think would look at the 2 fish we've just put in and think that on face value these 2 fish aren't really so different, but if we look at the finer qualities of those fish we can see that from a future perspective the level's actually much different. Now this fish in the middle is actually Sansai, whereas the others are all Nisai, and the key issue really with this one lies within the sashi area of the fish. And what you can see is that on this area the sashi is just a little bit too obvious, and in this area it's almost as though the sashi is so prominent that it's almost like secondary he deep underneath the skin shining up through the white. And as you can see on this area the sashi is actually very prominent, and it is to the point where there is actually colour underneath the skin shining up through the white scales.
Oh, I see. It's almost 4 scales, isn't it?
And this really is the reason why that when you're buying a younger fish you really need to choose a fish with very even and consistent sashi, because soft colour and sashi that's deep and uneven will quite often end up developing colour underneath the skin in this manner, which is very off-putting and really results in a fish becoming virtually worthless. So because of this fish really has got much less value than the other fish. And if we look at this fish, realistically the weaknesses lie predominantly within the colour. And this is also reflected in the look of the kiwa. You can see if you look within this area that the kiwa is Marazomi to the point where it's almost a little bit exaggerated, as though the scales are just starting to peel away from the pattern.
As you flex the fish you can almost see the white.
That's right, Greg, but in this particular case, in this area, it's not really so much of an issue because the pattern is really going horizontally along the fish, and it can't really go any different way across the scales than this. But if you look at that in combination with how the kiwa is running up around this area, where the scales are peeling away, this is a big weakness. So if you look at this fish, you can see that really virtually every scale throughout the pattern of the fish is kind of almost exaggerated Marazomi, and therefore it shouldn't really last so long in the future. It might fall apart relatively prematurely. In actual fact, this fish came in as relatively inexpensive Tosai, and in all fairness the fish has got better. As the fishes got older, the key was slowly consolidated and improved in this area, but to be quite honest, I regard this as being a case of easy come, easy go, because the quality is not so good. So what you'll find is when this fish grows up bigger, is it will slowly kind of revert to having the weaknesses it had when it was younger. So perhaps in the short term, maybe another year or so, this fish will look very attractive for the koi show, but it's certainly no prospect for growing jumbo. It just won't really last long enough.
So its peak will be quite short. The last things to come right will be the first things to go wrong?
That's right, Greg. So these areas that you see that maybe in the short term are slowly improving and getting better because the quality is not so good, it will slowly then perhaps revert back to having the same weaknesses again later on. Now the body type on this fish is also not really so good. Although the fish looks okay, it's got a kind of lack of power to its backbone, and also underneath the body line is a little bit more kind of feminine and delicate. And the way that it pulls into its tail tube is also a little bit more delicate.
And what causes that? What gives it that look? Is it a tail tube issue, or is it a front end of the fish issue? What is giving that more delicate sort of look to the fish?
It's the skeletal structure really to start with, because the skeleton structure really isn't good enough, or is dictating that it's not really capable of putting on the right kind of body weight in the right kind of areas. Whereas in the case of this fish here, if you look at this, you've got the right kind of skeleton structure, you've got that kind of power, you've got the head, you've got everything really there that you need in order to kind of build up and make a really good big fish later on. Whereas this one is just generally more delicate, and it's almost as though it's kind of slightly flat on either side and more feminine looking. It's not going to be so good later on. The main issue for me really with this fish is purely down to the quality. The skin quality of the fish is very translucent, you can more or less see straight through it. And this also reflects in the way the colour is. The colour is also very translucent and just lacks thickness and shine. The quality of the colour on this fish just cannot be compared to the other fish that are in the bowl.
So you're saying that the quality of the red on the fish is affected by the base skin quality?
It is. It's like a foundation. And it's much easier if we compare it to this fish here, because this one has got the best skin quality and colour condition. You can see we've got two different kinds of white skin here. One is like a thick and creamy shiny white, whereas the other one, this one here, it almost looks like it's kind of a blue and translucent sort of look to it. So as this fish grows up, what you'll find is that the skin will never really become good and won't provide a good foundation for the colour.
See, I think that many people would initially be attracted to this fish due to the brightness of the white.
Yes, and they would do so really because this fish appears to be predominantly whiter in the facial area, whereas this one is kind of like a creamier, thicker white. But this really is a condition thing, and what we need to think about is that we're now into the growing season, and where you've got fish with nice and good glossy thick skin, what you'll find is it's very easy to actually influence the condition of that skin by higher temperatures and higher protein food and food with colour content as well. That also will result in the fish condition or skin condition actually becoming slightly creamy or almost yellow looking. This pond is currently at 23.5 degrees, and consequently that's resulted in this kind of look to the skin on the face. But this is very easy to change, either by lowering the temperature or feeding lower protein food or wheat germ food, that kind of thing. It's very easy to actually brighten the skin back up. So if you're trying to grow a fish to jumbo, forget about things like skin condition in this case, because this is something that when you grow the fish up jumbo, it's very easy to actually manipulate it later on into becoming much brighter. This fish, on the other hand, is really the way it is because the quality of the fish is just lower. It's not a condition thing, it's purely lower quality, and therefore the skin appears to be whiter. The condition of this fish may not look quite so good now, but the quality is actually very, very high. So as a jumbo prospect, this fish is going to look much, much better in the future. So what you'll find is where you've got two different levels of fish as a young fish, you'll find that one fish will go up in this manner and the other one will slowly go down in this manner. So that difference in quality between the two fish becomes much wider as the fish gets older.
One thing that was quite apparent as you put those two fish side by side a few minutes ago was the difference in colour. People talk about hard and soft colour, and soft always being very orangey and hard being a brighter red. Can you explain what you mean by hard and soft within its own colour type?
So within a certain bloodline of a Kohaku, you could have perhaps one that is more orange than another one, and yet it can also be thinner and therefore a lot more prone to colour damage and a lot less likely to regenerate colour. These fish will tend to be actually redder, and you'll see that more exaggerated Kira as well, which kind of reflects that instability within the colour. Whereas a higher quality one or softer one within that same bloodline will usually be, if it's been raised in the same manner this is, it will usually be a softer kind of colour and much thicker and shinier, and the Kiwa will usually look more like the higher quality examples that we've seen here. And that kind of colour is very easy to fix up again.
I actually think this is useful as well. Having fish of different levels in a bowl, while this is by no means awful, and I feel we've maybe slaughtered it, having it in a bowl next to something that is superior gives you a comparison. It would be very easy to walk into someone and say, wow, look at the white on that.
So yes, Greg, it is all relative. You really need to, a koi like this is not a bad koi, but you really need to see a koi like this alongside a much higher level example in order to realise, firstly, how perhaps inferior this fish is, and also likewise how good the good one is. Because if you go into a dealer's place, for example, and you see a whole load of fish of a certain level, it's easy to pick out what you think the best fish is there, and to perhaps to be very impressed with it. Until maybe you get it home and you put it alongside something of a much higher level, and then suddenly it becomes apparent perhaps how inferior those fish were as a whole. But you do need, I think, to be exposed to extremely high level fish in order to actually have some kind of benchmark on all of this, some kind of mark to measure everything against.
Special ones seem very few and far between.
Yes, indeed they are, Greg. Everybody thinks if you go to Japan, fish of this level are just all over the place. But in reality, if you go to any really good breeder, the very special fish are very few. Fish like this are very hard to come by. So really, to sum up on all of this, what we've looked at now is Nisai, and on the whole, the differences between these fish is not really so great. But the important thing really is to now apply that knowledge or that understanding to looking at Tosai and selecting Tosai, because with Tosai, the differences you would see in these fish as Tosai would be much less apparent. So hopefully this will make it easier really to understand the next stage of this DVD.